Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay.
Welcome, Austin and Jim. Thought we'd talk about Bong Marcos. What a great name. I'm interested to see what Saturday Night Live will do with that. I'm sure there are some sketches that could come out of it. But Jim, Duarte has left. He had been trying to hold off the Chinese. Is Bong going to change what the Philippines is doing with South China and their guerrilla problem and also their drug problem?
Well, he says he won't. All those efforts were very popular, and most of them were successful. The drug problem did decline, but the drugs were still coming in, increasingly from China, of all places. China is the major source of fentanyl. But, you know, there's still a market for illegal drugs in the Philippines, and no matter what you do, there will still be people willing to risk everything, you know, to get it, you know, to sell it, distribute it, and what have you. So Duterte did, you know, reduce that problem. He earned a lot of criticism from foreign countries, especially Western countries, because he basically unleashed the police, and it was basically, you know, shoot on sight, including suspected, you know, drug dealers. Now, his approval ratings for that were consistently high. I mean, people wanted the drug dealers, especially the corruption the drug dealers basically financed. The drug dealers didn't want police on their backs. They basically were willing to pay or intimidate anybody they had to in order to keep going. Duterte, who had a record of cracking down on corruption, he was the mayor of Davao City in the South, and he basically cleaned that up in many respects. And people expected him to do the same as president. Now, presidents only serve 1 6-year term, so he knew he was out, and he's out now. I mean, the Marcos Jr., Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has taken over. Now, you may wonder, how did the son of Ferdinand Marcos Sr., a president who basically blew through the Constitution, he served as a dictator for basically 20 years and was forced out eventually and into exile, you know, by a uprising that he couldn't put down. Now, eventually, you know, he died, and his children were allowed to return. And Marcos Jr. promptly began, you know, cultivating a political following. He had one huge advantage in a country like the Philippines. He had name recognition, and his father had done some things that people, you know, remember him, you know, positively for. They did not like the fact that he ruled as a dictator, and that's what eventually got him, you know, tossed out. And so there's really no real stomach for another dictator. Now, you may wonder, well, are they going to trust another Marcos? Well, there you run into another situation that's unique, not unique to the Philippines, but it's in the Philippines and many other countries, is there's a couple of hundred families that basically dominate the elected, you know, senior positions in the government. A lot of them are local leaders. It was a particular problem in the South where most of the Muslim majority lives, because that area, even before the you know, Islam, you know, entered, had a reputation for private armies and feuds. Now, this was something that really was present throughout the country when the Spanish took over. The Spanish converted most of the population to Catholicism. They basically reduced a lot of the violence, and then the Americans came in, and one thing the Spanish weren't doing was guaranteeing independence. The Americans came in, tossed the Spanish out, put down, you know, some of the rebellious groups, and promised independence in 1944. The World War II and a Japanese occupation intervened, and you know, the Americans were determined to keep their promise, so it was delayed only 1 year. despite the fact that, there was still a lot of warfare going on, not with the Japanese, but with various, political groups, especially the communist groups, who didn't want any democracy at all. Anyway, that particular aspect of the American occupation is, if not fondly, is remembered, is respected. That's rare in that part of the world. Every place else in Southeast Asia that had a colonial government basically had to fight a long bloody war against their colonial oppressors. The Americans said they were going to get out, and they got out, even if they had to defeat the Japanese first. Subsequently, Philippines still had the problem with the powerful families. These families had accumulated land, and so many of them started. They already had local power, warlords, whatever, feudal lords, as it were. That's an old tradition, but they tended to use their power to accumulate more money and influence. And Duterte, said he was going to do something about that. He did, but not enough, because he found out it was far more entrenched than even he believed. I mean, he knew the extent of it in the southern Philippines, in Davao, the city where he was in. But when he got into the national stage, he realized, the rest of the country wasn't much better off as far as the control of the families went. Now, as expected, the first thing, Bong did when he got into power was eliminate the present commission that was charged with recovering the up to $14 billion that his father had stolen and gotten offshore. Some of it has been recovered, but a lot of it has not. And there are still suspicions that, Bong knows where some of it is, and he's simply looking for a good opportunity to suddenly become wealthy. So, I mean, he's tainted with that. But he got elected because he made a lot of promises that basically hit the right, note. Taking care of the poverty, the poor education, and what have you. The trouble was, those are all promises that he's unlikely to be able to keep. It requires money. It requires suppression of corruption. And remember, for a politician in office, corrupt politicians are your friend. In other words, they're better as a friend than as an opponent, because as an opponent, they can be formidable, as his predecessor Duterte discovered. Now, another quirk of the Philippines Constitution is that this used to apply in the United States years ago. The vice president is elected separately, in their own right, and his vice president is Sara Duterte, which is the daughter of his predecessor. Now, father and daughter didn't always get along because she was a strong-willed woman, just like her dad. So they had a sort of a feud, towards the end, but they're still father and daughter. They're still family. And most important of all, while the president is restricted to 1 6-year term, the vice president, who's first in line to become president, if something happens to the sitting president, and that's happened several times in the past, she can vote for 2 terms. So she can vote for re-election. So she's definitely gonna be around when Bong ends his 1-year term. I doubt if Bong will try and change the Constitution. That's a bit much, no matter who's trying to do it, and especially if they're Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Because he's basically played it straight since he got back in the 90s, and has been basically a model citizen. And he that was no accident. He realized the only way he was going to reestablish the family as a political powerhouse was to play by the rules as they existed, and he has done that. But his promises to oppose the Chinese might run into the same problems that Duterte ran into. The Chinese are basically willing to engage in a buyout of the Philippines. Duterte wouldn't be bought. He also pointed out that a lot of the economic promises, investments, and what happened, the Chinese promised with no strings attached, were never made. And this is typical, Chinese, tactics. The Chinese are still using their creep, grab, and hold tactics, whereby they don't attack, they don't use military force, but they do have this huge naval militia, which we've written about frequently in Strategy Page. And they are want to, and their most potent weapon is hundreds of fishing trawlers, which are obliged as part of the Naval Reserve to quit their fishing and to go serve for a few months with the Navy. Now they get paid for this. They also became fishing boat owners through direct government grants. Basically, the Chinese government subsidized the creation of this huge ocean-going fishing trawler fleet, and they are now outlaws worldwide for encroaching on fishing, lucrative fishing lands, places, areas where they are not allowed. And there have been a few countries, especially in South America, where they have been basically fired upon. And it's basically a game of cat and mouse. Sometimes the Chinese, the innocent Chinese, fishing trawlers are escorted by Chinese Coast Guard ships in case somebody fires on them, like pirates or the local Navy trying to protect their exclusive economic zone. The Chinese have been successfully using this in the Philippines, or in the areas that the Philippines claims in the South China Sea. They've been using it against all the countries that have, by international law, exclusive economic rights in the South China Sea. China declared that those rights null and void, even though a international court in a lawsuit filed by the Philippines agreed with the Philippines and ruled that the Chinese were acting unlawfully. The Chinese said the law didn't apply to them. They basically concocted a lot of bogus historical evidence showing that they'd been there a long time ago and they'd been absent because, World War II, revolution, civil war, et cetera, et cetera. So they are ignoring that, and they are basically occupying reefs, especially, saying that while they're sheltering from storms, but in many cases, I mean, this is ludicrous. Another problem they have is the commercial satellite photos, which anybody can buy, and many news organizations do. They show that the sheltering Chinese, dozens of sheltering Chinese trawlers are basically tied up together and are just sitting there, and the weather's calm, and they're basically blocking entrance to the reef to Filipino ships or any other ships without making any comments. Say, hey, we're here, you can't go past. This has almost brought, caused the Filipinos to fire on the Chinese. Now, they don't really want to do that, A, because they haven't got a large navy. The Chinese are very close to home, and they're afraid that might give the Chinese, the incentive to go to war, a war which, Duterte pointed out, we can't win. Now, we have a non-aggression pact with the United States, but that, how should I put it? The participation of the United States varies from, president to president. So they basically are at their survival is at the whim of whoever's running the United States at the moment. So the Chinese are just waiting. They basically created illegally artificial islands. Once they get a reef, that they can keep the owners out of, they'll bring in dredging ships and basically dredge up sand and create these artificial islands. They'll build civilian, safety bases, weather forecasting, refuge for shipwrecked sailors, in a storm or what have you. But eventually the troops move in on some of those early islands. They've now got, anti-ship missiles, anti-aircraft missiles, landing strips long enough to support, fighters and bombers, and which occasionally fly in there. They have several supply ships built exclusively for the support of these islands because a lot of them basically have no water, no food, and they have to constantly resupply. So the Chinese are very vulnerable, but basically there's nobody there who's willing to go to war with them over it. And the Chinese feel that they're willing to be more patient, and eventually the enemy will tire, make mistakes. They'll grab more territory, and eventually it'll all be theirs. I mean, that is basically an old, Sun Tzu, Chinese military philosophers' advice. It's much cheaper in the long run to win battles, without win wars without battles, but basically using, wealth and bribery and whatever it takes. So the Chinese are basically operating right out of Sun Tzu's playbook. They're doing the same thing along the Indian border, um, and so far, it's successful. Not so successful that they're basically invoking, international censure for going to war, but they are reclaiming territory. Bong says he's going to do something about that, but he hasn't proposed any, this solution. Now, what he is doing, and what his predecessor was doing, was buying more modern weapons. Now, the Philippines, as part of the growing local anti-China Defense Alliance, whose most prominent members are South Korea and Japan, and now Australia, Singapore, you name it. Everybody who's got skin or areas or disputed areas in the game has joined in, and Philippines economically is the weakest link, so they have been getting money and weapons, ships, and what money they do have has basically paid for 2,400 ton offshore patrol vessels from South Korea. They started to receive Israeli anti-aircraft systems, and they've already received second-hand patrol aircraft from Japan. They've received smaller patrol boats from Australia and other countries. So they are building up a respectable, coastal defense force. Well, coastal means way out. Your exclusive economic zone extends about 360 kilometers from your nearest coastline, and they have plenty of territory out there, which the Chinese, being 2 or 3 times further away, and actually in no way is the Chinese EEZ overlapping, are basically being slowed down, as it were. And if the Philippines gets stronger and stronger and more aggressive, the Chinese might have a problem on their hands, because if their bluff is called, they may have to back off and come up with something new, which they always do. But again, the Chinese are very patient. They're willing to wait for generations, through many Filipino presidents, to succeed, and eventually they'll find one they can buy off and get major concessions. Bong insists he will not be that president. He probably won't, because one thing that'll lose you a lot of popular support in the Philippines is selling out, to an aggressive neighbor, and China is aggressive neighbor number one. Beyond that, it's business as usual.
So, Austin, how do you see Bong's leadership going with the Philippines?
Dan, Jim brought up something that is crucial to this discussion, and that is the Chinese being patient and looking for a note down for this
Austin, we're completely losing you.
War. Yes.
We're your audio is just
hello.
Not working.
I haven't changed anything.
Yeah, I understand that.
What's in it? I'm not sure what to do.
Well, it's a satellite link, and so what you predicted, was happening.
Wait a minute, Jim. Something just popped back up. Can you hear me any better now?
Yes.
Yeah, we can.
Is it any better now?
Yeah, it's still going in and out.
I'm not sure what to do about it.
I think what we'll do is
everything looks.
I'll just ask Jim another question, and then we'll wrap it up. Okay.
Oh, now. What about now? All right, go ahead and do that. I'm sorry, guys. I don't know what to do. You know.
Yeah.
I've got this thing juiced to the max.
Is this going to be the situation from now on, or?
I hope not. Problems with my computer. Zero. I'll ask them if I can up the megabytes per second in some shape, form, or fashion. It says that everything's right. I mean, I can see the Wi-Fi right now, and everything is all linked up. And you heard what it sounded like at the beginning.
Yeah, now you're sounding okay, but I'm just worried about it starting to break up again, and there's no way I can edit around that.
Okay.
It's almost.
Understand it. Let me fire out a real quick answer then. All right.
Okay, go ahead.
Jim just hit on a very important point. And that's the Chinese waiting on a leader that they can buy out. And if you go back and look at the 1985 first edition of A Quick and Dirty Guide to War, James F. Dunnigan on Austin Bay, we had a chapter on the Philippines, The Sick Man of ASEAN, about how corrupt Ferdinand Marcos's government was and how it was destroying the Philippines, which is a country that has all the elements democratic policy that's wealth producing. It didn't because of the corruption. Jim already mentioned that Ferdinand Sr. stole over $14 billion, supposedly. Now, I don't know whether Bong's going to be crooked or not. He says he's not, but he's the kind of leader that can be manipulated. I'm sure the Chinese have got a portfolio on him, a dossier about all of his, anything they could blackmail him with. It's a return of the old families in a major way. Duterte was a difficult character, but he did what he told the Filipino people he would do. He was going to go after the drug dealers and the crooked. And he was certainly somebody outside of the elite families that run the Philippines. Bong is right from the heart of really what was the most crooked of elite family governments. Now, Jim laid out a good description of what the Chinese are up to, also some of the other threats that the Philippines face. I want to say China isn't reclaiming anything in the South China Sea. It's making claims that are absolutely outrageous. The Annamese, the Vietnamese have solid claims going back to the 12th century on, and the Chinese have come in and taken islands in that zone. Some of the charts that crop up, there's some Spanish, but also old Malay claims in the South China Sea. The Chinese weren't there at all. It was predecessors to the current Filipinos and Malaysia. It's an outright aggressive imperialist sea grab is what it is. And as Jim pointed out, they build all these artificial islands. The Philippines has a mutual defense pact with the United States. And that's so that Philippines has backup that the Vietnamese don't have. But the thing is, the United States has to be able to back up the Philippines. And that's when Jim talked about, what does the U.S. do now that Ukraine has brought the Eastern Front back onto the front burner? That's not necessarily up for grabs with an issue Bong wants to deal with, but I think a vast majority of the Filipino people do. As Jim pointed out, they won't want to bend over to an aggressor, and the aggressor now is China. To our listeners, go check out several things we've written about the 2016 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea decision by the International Arbitration Court that gave the Philippines 98% of what they wanted in their grievance and their complaint. China had just not taken resources, fishing, land and encroached on Filipino territory, not just EEZ. There's something, I forget the number. It's about 7,600 islands or so, 7,700 Filipino islands. They cover a great deal of sea area. And China wants to break through. They want to break through the first island chain and then out through the second island chain and then get into the Western Pacific. And that's their aim. They're going to wait. Well, I'm not sure how long Xi Jinping really does have to wait because he's got a lot of problems at home.
Well, that's a good place to end it. We will continue to watch Bong and his activities, and I'm sure we'll be covering him again. So thanks, and we'll talk to you gentlemen next time.
Take care.
Bye.